We don't have Scott, but that's okay. I'll keep moving and maybe he'll show up. So, right, you can kind of see what I had planned to do for this meeting was to start by doing a little overview of the document. And at the very end of the document is a list of questions. And does everyone have the URL? I'll put it in the Zoom chat just in case that's convenient for people. The idea was you can, of course, you can ask questions, but better if they're like complicated or something, throw them at the end. Then we will take a little time to think about questions, and people can put their names on ones that they think will be interesting, and we'll spend some time talking about them.
So I read the document ahead of time, and I wrote questions in the rendered view, and I realize now you may not have even looked for that feedback channel.
No, I didn't. You left comments or something like this?
Yeah, if you skim, you should on the right hand side see the little
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So these are not like big, like this is more like I didn't understand what was intended in certain parts of the text. So it's not like
Yeah.
things I think are appropriate for the bottom. It's more like I just didn't understand what was written.
Looks like I also had some incomplete sentences where I failed to finish my thought. Okay, well, there aren't that many, so we'll get them as we go.
All right, I'll try to bring them up if you want me to actually interrupt you with them. I can do that, or you can, depends on whether you want to look at the rendered view at the same time or not, really.
Yeah, well, at least for the
For the
open this in.
screencast. For the screencast, it's probably better if you don't because it'll
Yeah, it's too confusing. I'm opening it in a separate window for
awesome
for my purposes. Okay, so let's go down the motivations. This is stuff I'll go quickly-ish, but I feel like we talked about this the last time. But basically, we've been talking on and off about how to grow the Lang team and just in general how to make it work more efficiently. And one of the observations that came out of that was that we don't necessarily want to grow the Lang team per se. We might want to change its structure because it's useful to have a smallish core of people who are kind of the key consensus decision makers. And if we grow that set too large, it becomes unwieldy. Maybe we lose some sense of the overall like coherence and design taste or something like that because it's more people. But also that there's a whole lot of different skill sets that are useful to the Lang team, right? So some of them might be like pursuing large projects is one thing, but other people prefer to focus on smaller knits or paper cuts. I think there are some skill sets that we don't necessarily weren't always aware of as skill sets that we could use. I include like monitoring the zeitgeist. So sort of surfing internals, knowing what people are talking about, what issues people are hitting, that kind of thing. And being able to sort of use that as feedback for prioritization or just look for promising ideas that are surfacing and bring them to wider attention. I think I would say in addition to like feature proposals, there's different levels of the language, right? So we have things like async 08 or the borrow checker that are kind of high level-ish, and then things like C unwind that are really grungy platform specific details. There's formal rules, reference material. So I think trying to put all this into one team, it doesn't make sense. It's a really different sets of skills, and we should optimize for them. I already kind of said this, that we want to grow, but we can't. So these are all reasons I think having just one team isn't a good idea. I would add in here that there's a lot of like maintenance tasks that mostly I just do them, and that's okay, except that it takes me several hours a week, and they feel like they should be distributable and something we could share out, and we haven't ever been effective at making that happen. I would like that. And some of them just don't happen. Like I would say, we don't really have blog posts that summarize our meetings, for example, because it's too much. So coming down, oh, this is hard to see in this format, but oh well. One of the things that I would say about that is that previously we had thought about groups like shepherds or other kinds of groups as stepping stones on the way to full team membership. And what's different about this proposal is that they're not intended that way. They're intended as teams in their own right that people might want to be a part of because they're doing a style of work that people enjoy, and they're all doing important work that needs to get done. But there would be perfectly valid to just be a shepherd or just be someone doing triage, and just isn't really the right word, but to only do that. It would also be valid to be a Lang team member and a shepherd and so forth. I didn't actually define those terms yet, but that's the idea. So I think that's an important thing to convey because it wasn't always, in people that I previewed this doc with, it wasn't always clear. And so part of my thinking here was trying to identify, like, eventually I'd like to have sort of maybe job descriptions or something, but yeah, what are the kind of person we think would be good at some of these different roles? And here's the set of roles that I've identified. So we have the main Lang team, and I see Felix, you had a comment. Oh, well, your first comment was tactical and not requiring. I think what I meant to say was like extended engagement on a particular topic. I don't know how to describe that, but
Mika,
Yeah,
you just ruined the day of whoever was manually indenting all of them.
luckily it was me. It's my own fault. I foiled myself. I specifically was asking in my question about, like, is this somebody who doesn't need extended engagement? Is that somebody who doesn't want decision-making authority, for example, or doesn't want to attend the meetings
I think
regularly?
Yes to both. I think also, like, who has a couple hours a day, or like not a day, but has time that is sporadic maybe. And it sometimes has to drop out for a week or two.
I would like to
I
hope
think
that
that-
any of us could do that, actually. But yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but it's easier in some roles than others.
Mhm.
More impactful. I don't know. Maybe that's not quite the right description. I would have liked to. I should ping. I'm thinking a lot about the compiler team prioritization group. I've been asking Santiago about it a little bit because I would like to get a feeling for how that works better. I think that's a good model. We can talk about triage later though. But that's kind of what I meant by that, at least, maybe. So, right, the main Lang team I see as kind of top level, ultimately deciding on like which RFCs get accepted. So this is ultimately deciding the syntax and semantics of the language. Also guiding sort of which project proposals to start, and that kind of coordination activity. And then
the thing I asked about here was about should there be a sub-bullet under Lang team for specifically about resolving open questions, like when issues are nominated, for saying we need the Lang team to decide this.
Yes, I think that's right. I think making
the hard decisions, perhaps.
Right, decisions that come up, or like resolving decisions that come up. I guess it's more questions in open PRs or on issues about the finer points of language semantics. Deciding which lints to accept. Those are traditionally things we've done. I think in all these cases, as much as possible, I would like to see that guided by, like, these are the people that are kind of affirming the final decision, but not necessarily the ones
right
shaping all the arguments. That's always what we do anyway, because we're not experts in everything. So the other sub team does that make sense, Felix?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to make sure it was spelled out. Yeah.
Okay. The other sub team would be shepherds, and I see shepherds as, this is, I think, shepherds 4.0. If you count all the different times we've used the term, but it's closest maybe to the original way we used it, except that then I think it was a stepping stone idea, and I see this differently as people who are kind of more the front line, so to speak, of interacting with the greater community, reading up on internals, what I wrote here, identifying project proposal, like seeing ideas that seem to be getting a lot of traction and that look like they're kind of ready to be bubbled up to the greater team, and doing that. But I don't see it as going deep on any particular idea. Maybe people do participate in a thread, but not so much in their role as shepherd, unless it's like trying to summarize or generally unblock a thread. But more like, yeah, keeping an eye on things. And I don't know, I think we could formalize this a little better. Exactly what kind of, how much procedure and formality we need around that would be interesting. But I think the main role would be being able to answer questions like, have there been a lot of discussions on this topic? And maybe providing some summaries and also looking for things that could become project proposals, and encouraging people to do that. And just sort of guiding, being friendly and available when people have questions about how stuff works. Does that make sense? So triage subteam. I think what I would like to have right now, what happens, the triage process, is that I run a script. It scrapes out the nominated questions, and then we kind of, in theory, I do some pre-triage, which sometimes I have time to do and sometimes I don't. And we kind of go through them live. I think this is using a lot of time for tasks, like a lot of expensive time where all of us are there together. They could be done asynchronously. What I would like it to be is that in the meeting, we kind of have a really tight list with like, here's the question, here's the background information, or we know that the background information we need will be available. We don't have to like discover it live. And ideally there's sort of, the relevant actors have weighed in who have opinions. And so the question is how to make that happen. And I think that probably, what I'm imagining is that nomination goes from just being a tag to being like, well, you may just put a tag, but the people who first look at that tag is more of this triage subteam, and their role would be to like assemble that little packet and ask questions if pieces are missing. And they might talk to the shepherds, I could imagine, if it's like, hey, who would be a good person to ask about const generics? Like, who kind of knows about that, stuff like that. And that's the idea. Yeah, and I think this is basically what prioritization is doing for the compiler team, which is why I wanted to study a little bit the scripts and procedures there. Like, I think there's some nice tricks, like when an issue is nominated, something gets opened on a Zulip topic gets opened and so forth.
Yeah.
So
Definitely be nice to have
on.
more something around nomination to know what the question is, know that it was looked at, know that it had like a concrete whatever, so that
yes,
action could be taken more visibly somehow.
Step one of this, in my view, like I just described the end state I want to get to, but I don't think it'd be the first step. The first step is probably just making a template for like, how do you nominate something? It isn't just I type label nominate. It's like I write @rustbyte nominate and I write a little paragraph or something. And we have a page that says like, here's some information to think about including. Like even that would be progress, right?
And potentially asynchronously, like double check, like either us or somebody. I guess the triage subteam would be as part of their work,
right?
Reviewing those and saying, giving feedback, saying, no, this needs some more.
Yep.
Things here. Yeah.
I imagine step one would be they look and see, did they write it at all?
Yeah.
They say, no, you didn't do it. And then as they get, I feel like it'll just happen that people will be like, oh, you know what'd be useful? Maybe you can add this before the meeting. Documentation subteam. I don't have a lot of, I didn't really dive too deep into this, but we already have this team and they're doing awesome stuff. And I talked to them a little bit. I mean, I think we'll want to do more here at some point, but it's not the main focus of this document. And the final thing is projects and project groups, right? So I think these are ad hoc and not necessarily strictly under T-laying, but kind of pursuing specific ideas that we've authorized. And I think this has been working pretty well. This is basically the existing structure. So this is our existing meeting structure. Nothing changes here. These are our Zulips. The only thing is I added some extra things. And I started writing up, I want to have a page on the document. Like part of this, I want to be the sort of user interface where what are all the things you might want to do that the Lang team can help you do? And ideally this would be, you know, if we go to langteam.rustling.org, it would sort of be this page here. I didn't get that far in this, but I would like to know the right questions. And one of the things I was trying to do was to figure out things like, why do people nominate issues? Right? We say nominate, but there's a wide range of things you might nominate for. And can we group them a little? And do they all want to follow the same process, or some of them maybe want to be different? And the last thing I was hoping is we could put some kind of SLA, like more for ourselves probably than anything, but how fast, but also to communicate expectations, right? If you're asking to stabilize an unstable feature, like, is that something we handle in a triage meeting and you should expect within a week or two, or is that something that maybe we do that only in our planning meetings once a month and you should expect to wait until then, something like that. Oh yeah, I did include that. Okay, that's it, I guess. Oh, well, there's path to membership, and then I'm done. It's taking a little more time than I hoped, but the main thing about path to membership was, I think that we've documented a little bit that in the past that the path to membership was project groups, and I think that's no longer the case in this proposal. Like, the path to membership is sort of get involved at any of these points. The only one that isn't really available to you as a starting point is the main Lang team. I think we expect people to kind of get involved in one of the other areas first so that we gain experience with them. You know, whether that be hacking on some specific ideas. So there's like room, this covers a lot of different involvement styles. I didn't write participating in RFCs. I don't quite know. I guess that fits into project group in my view. So there you go. That reaches the end of our summary section. I guess let's take a few minutes. Maybe people can add any questions and put names for things that they'd like to talk about in more detail. I'm going to set a timer. You have 5 minutes. But if you're bored, leave a comment, because maybe we'll all get bored. Oh, Josh writes a clarifying question. Why don't we just put this in the list, Josh?
Source will be tagging things as interested right now. Okay, as well. Right, that was the whole top 5 thing.
Okay. So anyone have more questions to add in?
I have a general feeling, and I don't know how to phrase it as a question.
Do
One of the primary things that we hit in triage sometimes is that things have just kind of sat for months and don't really have an owner and aren't really nominated. We've talked about ways to handle this in the past, but I guess I'm saying I don't know that I feel like we have an answer to that question yet. And I kind of feel bad sometimes going on people's like 2-year-old RFCs and being like, can you clarify this thing that you said 2 years ago for us? Then we just looked at it. Like, I don't know how to phrase that as a question, but
There's many questions I think hidden there. Like, you know, there's the backlog itself, and then there's the question of like, you know, should we be trying to address everything within a certain time frame because things become not useful anymore after a certain period of time because you can't expect people to necessarily still be engaged.
right. We talked about getting sort of more aggressive about closing RFCs and requiring project proposals, I think partially because we wanted to be able to pay more active attention to all of the currently open RFCs. I feel like we still haven't quite gotten to that point.
we haven't yet. Partly that was the goal of the last week's like backlog bonanza, was to kind of keep that work moving along. And now there's a bunch of action items that need to be done. A lot of them by me. I don't know what's the answer to that. I mean, I think you're right that was my thought, was that we would try. That was sort of the motivation, partially for the SLA and partially for the backlog bonanza, was to try to first close out more backlog, and second, you know, have more steps and queues along the way so that we don't get too much backlog to begin with, but also like think of our procedures and try to stay on top of things. Like I've noticed that when we first introduced the project proposals, they just sat there for a long time. So I've been making a real point that we should drive them to some resolution. And I think it's been helpful. I've been happy. There haven't been too many, so it's hard to say. But like I'd rather people get an answer, even if that answer is come ask us again in 2 months, than no answer.
Right. I kind of wonder if there's a way that we could divide up some of that triage effort, because I do think it's wasted time to have all of us like using our time synchronously to go and look at like every single issue that hasn't received a new comment in 2 weeks. But I do think like that's something that if I felt like there was like a process around it, like if we each got, I don't know, 5 RFCs or whatever, and our job was to go, you know, summarize the most recent comments, or, you know, if we assigned that to Shepherds or someone else, like, you know, that seems like that would be valuable engagement.
That feels like a Shepherd sort of task to me. It's like broad. That's the kind of thing I imagine maybe Shepherd or triage, kind of broad and relatively low investment. Okay, so I'm trying to think how to phrase that. Maybe we can do something. We can have maybe some groups in this set can periodically revisit older things to see if they can be moved along. That's kind of the idea, right?
I wonder if Taylor's suggestion of like just divvying up the RFCs, 5 each or something, made me realize that a problem with that is that there can be wildly different workloads associated with, one RFC versus another. And I was just musing to myself about whether there's some way to predict that, right? In terms of the bulk of comments or the size of the RFC itself, some way of like trying to statically predict the actual workload associated with these things to make it a little bit easier to balance the associated effort of making sense of them.
All right. Well, before we go too far, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at which questions got the most interest. I think there was at least one that had a lot of people's names on it. This one. Which of the maintenance tasks were making the most work? Are they providing sufficient value? And I can answer that. Should we talk about that for a little bit?
Sure.
I'll put a timer for 10 minutes. then we'll look at another question. Let me just add a section down here, discussion. So I haven't actually, the first thing is I don't of course know exactly, I haven't run a timer, but what I can say is I would say after the planning meeting, I have like 1 hour scheduled to write a blog post. So this is monthly, create summaries, create calendar events, leave comments on issues. It takes about an hour. Sometimes it takes more. I think I could do a better job with more time. Like, I think that the blog post, I would like it if we had, I would like it if the blog post told a more of a story, but part of that is getting better updates from project groups. And I haven't, that needs a little bit of work. There's a bit of, so there's a, like a, there's an item that I haven't had time to really do very effectively before the monthly planning meeting. Sort of pinging groups to get updates would be something we could do. And then in terms of the triage meeting, there's, you know, generating the agenda is easy. I don't know, 15 minutes. It could be made probably easier. I think uploading the video, minutes, linking things, that probably takes about 30 minutes all told. Should take less, but it always does.
Nico, can I ask a question? So when you say generating the agenda is easy and like you say 15 minutes, I guess to me that sounds interesting because one of the things we called out previously in this meeting is that there is potentially a need for a triage team. And if their task is to generate an agenda and it takes 15 minutes, then that seems odd. And I guess what I would maybe say is that it takes 15 minutes today, but in practice, maybe it actually takes a lot more time to do it well. Like you have to, you know, go through all the issues on it, review some scroll back, maybe leave some, you know, summaries. And that seems like a lot more than 15 minutes.
That's right. I think generating the raw agenda.
Yeah, today.
This means, this is just meaning like creating a, like the auto-generating the HackMD or whatever that we use, right?
Yes, right. This is not doing the work that we would like to do, right? So, but this does not include like looking at notifications, looking at, what do we call it, nominated issues, and kind of, nor does it include ensuring that we get to tasks that have been overlooked, things like that. Some of that stuff can be automated. Like, I think one of the big tricks that we did in the prioritization work group that's pretty important is writing a lot of scripting, right? Rather than doing things manually, although often doing it manually first and then writing scripts to make it much more maintainable. So it might be that it always takes 15 minutes, or it eventually takes 15 minutes again, but that's because there's a little bit of distributed work being done along the way. Like when the thing gets nominated, that's the point where the triage team kicks in and they go ask questions and get the comments in the right shape, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So that's the things that are happening now. Do I think they're important? I do. So the videos, I get a lot of people telling me that they watch them. And I think they're important for just general transparency. Plus, I don't know, every once in a while I go back and watch when I want to remember exactly what we said.
I will say, I think that they may provide value, but I also think there's some more effort into like structuring the video itself to like have bookmarks of the topics. Because when I've tried to like recover information, even looking at the agenda for that meeting, trying to find the part in the meeting where it's discussed can be painful, like scrubbing back and forth.
Yeah, definitely. And we could do, they could be a lot better. Even just recording in the agenda, like we could and probably should just record the time at which we, like in
Switch
the,
off. Yeah.
And then we can, that would make it easier for you to scrub, right? There's a lot we could do there. That's another of my thoughts, that like, it may not be that that's been the observation with the prioritization group, right? That having a set of people whose job is to think about how to expose information in a better way means that they do an amazing job. That if it's one person trying to juggle it with other things, that doesn't get done. And that is the answer to somebody asked, who do I see as doing this task? I think that's a triage task, personally. But like I saw it as part of that group's role was to publish and so forth. But it could be, I could see a case for it's a different.
That's fine, except for there's things like the summaries. It's a question of whether there's some things that the triage team may or may not feel comfortable trying to do.
Yeah, so they shouldn't have to produce content, right? So like, I think that summarizing a design meeting is probably better. Probably every meeting should have an owner and it's their job. But so I guess it's not such a simple answer.
Certainly design meetings having owners makes sense. That's okay. I'm still just thinking about that. There's things that come up in the triage meeting where there's some subtleties that can arise that if the notes are really good, then it's reflected there, but it's not always easy to take notes.
No, I don't think that the triage team should have the job of writing comments on issues, for example. Like that seems like that's the job of the learning team. All I meant is like I would be happy to like make a special Zoom account or and share the password, and somebody downloads the image and uploads it to YouTube, and maybe like pastes the minutes around and stuff like that.
I have possibly totally misunderstood the triage team. So the goal of the triage team is not to do triage, it's to set up triage.
I see the role of the triage team as ensuring that the right information is available for the Lang team to make that final decision.
I see.
Not to make the decision.
So it would be like someone goes through prior to our Lang team triage meetings, there's a triage team process via which people take all the nominated issues and summarize them in a format that gets given to the Lang team, but don't actually leave a comment on the issues.
That format might be a comment on the issue.
Right. I would generally expect that to be a comment on the issue, stating if there isn't already a clear summary. Or pointing to an existing one if there is.
I would also expect that if like the community discussion or potentially even like other Lang team members asynchronous discussing the matter, if it comes to like some sort of recommended course of action, that would be part of this too, right? Anything that can make our synchronous time in the meeting shorter,
yes,
which could include like recommended actions.
Yes.
Like for example, in the compiler team, I've made decisions just unilaterally, and then just as part of the compiler team meeting, I say as an item like I decided to beta pack board this unilaterally, like
right.
give people a chance to object.
I do think it's very possible that by asking some questions, it turns out that everyone's on this. Like sometimes they won't even reach the meeting because, or like it'll reach the meeting with a course of action already decided because a little discussion. They were able to link in the right person who left a comment, and we say, okay, yeah, we want to do whatever, so and so said. Sounds good.
Yeah, it may not. It could even not be a comment depending on, how much we want it to have its own flow somewhere. Maybe it's a comment, maybe it's not a comment. Maybe there's some way that whatever the equivalent of checkboxes or a straw poll or something can be done even before we end up in the meeting. People see it and go, oh yeah, that makes sense, and check, yes.
What I literally imagined is that we're sort of bleeding into like, how does the triage team work? That's okay. That it might be that they would leave a formatted comment, which can be extracted with a tool, so that the agenda is automatically generated every week, but the information is present in the issue with comments that say like triage : or I don't know what. I think I'm not exactly sure how the prioritization team does this. They have that like persistent summary for compiler team meetings. I think it's maintained by hand right now. I think it would be nicer if it were in the comments, but
yeah, there's some issues there. It's also generated sometimes a little bit too eagerly. And then things change over time, and the meeting time things have changed over what the summary says.
Right. Presumably we could share machinery. That was sort of what I'd hoped. So 10 minutes is done. Do we want to discuss a different thing? Or something else? Someone pick something. I'm just taking some notes here. Be nice.
So let's see, we have 2 votes for language features high level versus low level. Shepherds offered services is 2 votes. I don't know what that question means.
I think that means I interpreted that. Let's talk more about what shepherds would do. But
okay.
It looks like we have one item that has 3 and then several that have 2 people. Felix, you had an item for which subteam is doing the maintenance tasks.
Right. I think we
which I think
mostly
is the
addressed
right
this just now, right?
I think we mostly did, yeah. Though I
and
think
like,
it's worth putting in more effort to make sure there aren't things that only one person is doing or can do.
yeah. I think the ones with the highest votes we have addressed, and there's a whole bunch with 2 votes.
Yeah.
okay.
Can I suggest we prioritize the ones that aren't just Nico and myself, since we've been having a bunch of async discussions about this anyway?
Sure. All right. Yeah, we did this. We did that. Well, why
How
don't we talk about
some language features are high level and some are very low level? Should we divide these responsibilities more formally?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I
I
think
like
that
talking about the
plays
borders
into
of
some
teams.
the other questions in terms of how do we draw boundaries or similar, or how much do we?
Does high level and low level here refer to like how related to hardware it is, or does it refer to how related to like nitty-gritty details is it?
Hand wave, it sounds like possibly both.
Yeah.
I think, Felix, did you write this one?
No, I don't think I did.
Oh, interesting. I'm curious then who
I think it might have been
ultimate.
Ryan.
Okay. I think it's probably less important to observe like what the exact division is in terms of high level, low level. It's more what areas of interest and responsibility do people have, or interest and expertise rather. And do we want that to be just informal? Hey, this is probably the person to ask on this area or that person for that area. Or do we want any formality attached to, hey, this person is the person who should be working on this issue or that issue?
So I have a few thoughts. First, we've tried to tackle this in the compiler team a few times, and I don't feel we've completely cracked the nut here. One of the things we talked about doing but never quite pulled off is sort of a list of areas. I still think that's a good idea, of like areas of the compiler where at least some areas would have groups and they make the decisions about that area. But what I wanted to say is we could also take this question in a less general way. Instead of saying high level, low level, etc., just there are some areas that we don't really have a lot of expertise in, and we tend to delegate. I mean, the linker is the main one I'm thinking of, but does it?
Macros too, right?
Yeah.
Name resolution, yeah.
I think, well, the difference between those two is I think we should own macros, but I think we don't necessarily want to own linkers, but it's good to have them in the list.
Ryan just put a comment in the chat saying, my original thought with this was platform agnostic, but I think it works in many different ways.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, so the reason I asked my question about what we meant by high and low level is that like there are a lot of details of name resolution that I think about as kind of like low level concerns, in the sense that like I want someone who's like smart and knows about the area to make an informed decision, in much the same way that I want, you know, people to make decisions about specific linkage rules, right? And that's a different question than our like overall strategy of how, you know, how error handling works in Rust, or how async works in Rust, right? And so viewing this as like levels of involvement is sort of a different question than the literal sense of like are like linker and like, you know, ABI issues or something.
Would it be fair
something we
to
want to split off.
Would it be fair to describe the distinction you're drawing there as some things need deep compiler knowledge and some things don't in order to do language design?
I think it's compiler knowledge is part of it, but I think it's also like some things are very like, I don't know, some things are details that come out more clearly during implementation and are the kind of like nitty gritty things that can take a little while to resolve, but aren't necessarily the sort of high level question of like, do we want this feature?
I'm trying to, it looks like the list we were starting to write, I didn't really agree with as things that Lang shouldn't own.
I misinterpreted the phrase. I did not.
I think I just want to jot down what Taylor just said because it was important. I thought it was good. Some details tend to come out during implementation. That was sort of what you were saying. I
and
guess
some are things that lend themselves more to like a particular specification rather than a strategy. And so having the Lang team, guide strategy versus particular, details of the approach is sort of.
Yeah, so it's kind of tactics versus strategy.
Yeah.
I think I see that as being, I do think this is an important distinction, and it's sort of the area, it's sort of the same thing I was getting at with areas in the compiler. And I wanted to say projects were part of how I saw the answer here, but I actually don't know if I agree with that because projects seem like or they have like an end state. They're like, implement this thing, do that task. Whereas what we're talking about here is more like, maybe we want a persistent team that acquires the deep knowledge to answer the detailed questions, answer the tactical questions around macros and name resolution or, trait resolution. Like, should we add feature? Does adding feature X take us to another kind of logic or whatever? It's an important question. But if you're asking like, should we have implied bounds because is December implications of implied bounds more important than the convenience they bring? That's more Lang team, right? Does that sound like the division you're talking about?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And maybe I sort of like the idea of having, this is what I wanted to do for areas, but haven't got around to it, and I still like it, which is, I think we could make teams for this and say, okay, this person is going to lead up a team that is focused on learning that area. And I think they probably do overlap with the compiler team because often it does go hand in hand with implementation, even though it's separate. But that team should be tactics, not strategy. Just taking notes on what I said. But I mean, does everyone agree with what I just said, or is there other thoughts? I feel like everyone's quiet.
I don't know. I guess I am wary of declaring that we can add teams for this just because we don't have, I feel like, a lot of historical success with teams being sort of spun up around tactics, especially on these sort of low level but still high context details. But I think that if we can do it, it seems positive.
Don't we haven't integrated very well, but it feels like NLL and traits were two examples where we did spin up teams, and there's definitely expertise emerging. Like Matthew Jasper came out of the NLL effort and is sort of the unofficial, like him and I are kind of the unofficial borrow checker team at this point, from what I can tell.
That's actually a thing worth noting and calling attention to, by the way. There are a set of things for which there are relatively small numbers of experts, but even then it's still worth documenting who those experts were, because not everybody knows that. As an example, if somebody asked me, who should we talk to about deep borrow checker knowledge, I would know to say Nico or the Polonius working group, but I wasn't aware of what Matthew Jasper was working on because I'm not in that area, so I don't necessarily know everyone who is. Documentation is really useful to know and to make sure that there isn't an automatic bias of availability towards these are the people I know who have this expertise, and therefore 10 times more things get dropped on them rather than other people who are also experts but less well known in that area, if that makes sense.
I think that's true. I guess what I would say is that at least my personal feeling has been that those teams exist, but I don't think they exist as teams, but more so as like, if I have a question, yes, I would go to Nico or Matthew perhaps. But if I have like, I haven't felt that there has been sort of like, I don't think there's a monthly strategy meeting about
But
how we want to
That's right.
polish the borrow checker.
Is
Right,
a
that's-
team, does a team require a monthly meeting? I don't, that was
Well,
why I
it's-
used the word areas, but I don't think teams need to have that expectation.
I don't, it's not about the monthly meeting so much as like, I would expect if we had a team that is sort of in charge of like borrow checker tactics, that there is some level of like potentially, you know, maybe right now we're not changing the borrow checker at all, and so maybe there's nothing, but it feels like they would be the origin, for example, for a project proposal like NLL.
And
When they
ongoing ownership of, you know, resolving issues, etc. I understand. I think I
Right.
understand what this is getting at in terms
But-
of there's.
Aren't they? Like, who do we ping when there's a borrow checker problem?
That's different though, right? That's
Why
a
is that- why is
pull-based
that different?
system versus
Well,
a
why-
push-based system.
But why can't
Well,
I don't understand why a team can't be pull-based.
Also, it's the same set of people who are likely to be driving new improvements to the borrow checker.
Also true.
I think the fundamental difference is that a pull-based system implies that there is not like, I think there are different expectations on like SLA and so forth in quotes than I have for a push-based system.
I don't know about push versus pull, but I'll definitely say that without a team, like there's a notion of like trying to, for example, get new people with knowledge.
This is the thing I'm thinking about. How do you get new members?
And
But I
feel
think
like
things are happening in those areas. Like traits and borrow checker are both examples where stuff is happening. There are
I guess
I think it's more like the way you get new members is you start a project and people from those teams are likely to be involved, or not even likely, but
That works great for like, you know, making new
virtually guaranteed.
features. It's great for making new features, but it doesn't help with like maintenance of the existing code base, right? Like Polonius.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
but
guess that's what I'm
okay,
getting
so
at.
is that not just fixing bugs? Like people show up, like how is that different from, let's say there's bugs in the borrow checker. Oh, I forgot to set a timer. I'm like, how are we talking this long? Dang it. It's all right. This was the only other thing we really had time for. We can keep this going, but I feel like there's an answer here. Like I do agree with you, Mark, that there's a different working style, but I'm not hooked on the word team, but I'm also lately a little disturbed by, I've lately kind of given up on trying to make new nouns for everything and having teams and groups and
I actually sort of,
but like I think that there's a different style of interaction that we haven't really formalized very well, but we do have, and that it might benefit from having some formalization. And it's this more pull-based, lazier style. So I'm kind of poking
agree,
at that.
but I think that if we are to establish, like for example, the borrow checker or the trait system, it is a fact that there are many issues in those areas that currently go untriaged, and they really need this sort of like deep knowledge of someone who is intimately familiar with the system and the compiler's implementation and potentially the language design sort of strategy around it, and can do that sort of triage. Like I don't think a sort of regular person could do it. And if we are to, you know, have a team, I feel like there exists work that needs to be done on sort of maintenance level, and it feels reasonable to say that if we call a group of people a team, those group of people should be at least in part responsible for making that work happen, whether that's by doing it themselves or potentially recruiting, growing the team and finding ways that we can identify people in the community who are interested in and able to do that work.
I think I was with you right up until the should. Because I think it's an implied prioritization that we have to be doing all the things. And I'm not sure. Like, I think it's true there are issues, and it's true that if anyone's going to prioritize them, it's going to be these people. And maybe they should, and maybe they shouldn't. But like, we have to, I think the problem is one of the reasons we sometimes fail at making teams is that we put too much expectations on them instead of just sort of looking at what's happening that's kind of working and making it work a little better, and then hopefully it grows. We start to jump right to like, okay, you need a weekly meeting and a roadmap plan. And then that puts a lot of burden and the thing collapses. So I'm looking for something less burdensome.
I completely agree that there is value in having a partial amount of like all of that. But I think that if we call it a team, there is an expectation that I can go to that team and I can help. And right now, that's not the case, or at least that's my impression, I think. And that's why I'm concerned.
Yeah, I guess
it seems like we're not making forward progress on that particular point of distinction.
Is it
whatever it might be?
Is it maybe possible to just provide like a useful like a contact list of people with expertise in an area that you can like ping an alias for that isn't the Lang team?
Yeah, and that's what the notification groups are, and that's certainly one option.
Yeah.
But like, those are a little different in purpose, but okay, let's document it, and I want to talk about next steps in the last 30 seconds. Yeah, I have to go too. Never mind, I don't want to talk about next steps. This was useful. I think the obvious next step is I will try to evolve this a little more based on the things we said. If folks want to talk about these questions more, please reach out to me.
All right.
And or I will reach out to you. Ciao.
Thanks.